Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and start my coil project. And so I've got two examples here of those mochi stirrup vessels. This one is like a little deer, and then this one is kind of the traditional head style that you would see. So I'm going to start with this one. So I know in the end, I need in the end this to be 18 inches tall. So I need to kind of figure out some of the proportions of this so that I can start working on that. So looking at this, it looks like the stirrup on top is going to take up about a quarter of this, while the head's about 3/4 of it. You know, right now this is 10 inches, so that's not quite tall enough. But if I double it, that'll get me to 20, so that's pretty good. 2 inches over is better than 2 inches under. And, you know, so I'm measuring the piece itself, not the piece of paper. So right now I know my overall height equals 20. The width of the head will be 11 inches. The width of the base is going to be 6 inches. If you notice, for the base, I'm just talking about from here to here, these sort of ear decoration. Ears are up here, but then there's this extra part that's some sort of maybe part of the outfit, but that's actually raised up. So I'm just focusing on this centerpiece right here, which is probably round or at least oval. So I'm going to start there and start plugging away. So I'm going to start this a little bit different than we started the pinch pot. Since I know I have a flat 6-inch bottom, I'm just going to grab a hunk of clay. And I'm just going to kind of smack it back and forth in my hands to start making this kind of flat, you know, thick pancake-like piece. And after I have that, I can just put it on the table, get that dry bit off there. And I'm going to kind of stretch this out, because right now this is way too thick. You know, this is probably 1/2 inch, almost 3/4 of an inch. So I need to stretch this out. And instead of trying to slam this down as hard as I can, that's not really going to do anything. You know, if we think about clay particles, if we just slam it down, they're just going to compact and compact and compact. They're not going to get wider. So we need to actually stretch this clay. And so to do that, I'm going to just sort of fling this on the table so that it hits the table, and then the momentum is going to keep the clay moving, but the bottom of it's going to stick to the table. I'm just going to flip this every time I do this, so I'm stretching from a different point. It's important as we stretch clay that it's all not in one direction, so that it's going to become much more even. Again, if it's uneven, it's going to want to crack. It's like that old saying, crack is whack. And so we can measure this. So all right, I got about 6 inches here. So I've got it wide enough, but it's not very flat. So I'm going to go grab a rolling pin. So in the ceramics room, there's a whole bunch of rolling pins. Some have handles, some don't. This one, you know, broke at some point, but it's not a big deal. You know, our goal for this, it's pretty much the thickness that I want. I just want to even it out, because it's probably hard to tell on video, but there's a flat spot in or a divot in the center. So I'm just going to very gently use this rolling pin and just roll this over the surface. Again, a couple different spots, rotating it each time, so that it's not compressing things in the same way. And I'll flip it over and do the same. If you can, it's probably hard to tell, but I'm not really using much pressure to do this, because I'm just worried about evening it out. I don't need to stretch it anymore at this point. So just nice, gentle pressure. And then as I mentioned with the pinch pots, and I'm going to mention with basically everything that we make, compression is so important to make sure that something doesn't crack, especially the base here. You know, clay doesn't like to be flat like this. Slabs like this, sheets of clay, are always going to be the weakest. You know, putting something on top of it, building the rest of this vessel is going to help with that, but it's still pretty weak. So I'm just going to smooth out both sides really well, compress it really well. And then I'm going to come back with my Lazy Susan like before. So similar to before, I want to make sure that I'm working on a board. This way, especially because this gets larger and I have to put it back on my shelf or move around the table or something like that, it's much easier to move this board. And you're just going to end up wrecking your piece if you try and pick the piece up by itself while it's still wet. So I did just move the slab, even though not very much. I'm going to go ahead and compress it again. So now I need that 6-inch bottom. And so I can kind of think about this do this a couple different ways. You know, I can try and measure out 6 inches. If I had a compass or something like that, that would be really helpful. But I don't. But what I can do is I can mark an inch. Whoops. Mark the beginning here. Let me center this better. So there's 6 inches. So now, not that mark, not that mark. These 2 inches, or I'm sorry, these 2 marks make 6 inches. So if I get this spinning and try and leave my needle tool in about the right spot, I should be able to just spin this around and get to 6 inches, give or take. So I'm a little wider in some spots, but a little bit more narrow here. It's not perfectly round, and that's okay. As you see with the process of this, it's going to get distorted really bad. So trying to worry about making this a perfect 6 inches right now is probably going to make you go crazy more than anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. Doing my best to follow that line, but not great in some spots. Now I need to go ahead and start making some coils for this to make this taller. But before I do that, I don't want to just start on this flat edge like that. Again, as we transition from flat to coils, it's going to be a really weak point. So this is going to be, if we don't take care with this bottom, it's going to be a portion that you're going to one day pick up your piece and you're going to be left with this flat slab bottom just sitting there because your piece is cracked off. So before I attach anything to it, I'm going to press this down so that I get more of a slope there, maybe like a beveled edge rather than that flat edge, because it's really hard in ceramics to work with flat edges. At a certain point, for some things that might be helpful, but for this it's not. So see, I have this much better shape now. That's going to be much easier for that clay to conform to that. So I'm going to grab my fork and just score this really heavily. And I'm going to move this for a second. Then I'm going to roll out a couple coils. Probably just one to get started. So I'm going to make a coil. I talked a little bit about this with the pinch pot video. But so some of this clay is clay scraps from that slab. So just that few minutes of making that slab has dried this clay out a little bit. So I'm just going to grab some of my water bucket here. And I'm just going to kind of press in a little bit of water into this clay just to help soften it up. Sometimes when you make a slab, and even if it just sits there for a few moments, it's going to get too dry and be hard to work with. So to start this coil, I've got a clean table. I want to make sure that there's no dust or dry clay flecks or anything like that. I'm just going to take this clay and sort of just squeeze it out in my hands into this almost like thick, long coil shape, essentially. Too thick right now. I'm going to go ahead and roll this out. And so when I roll this out, I want to think about a couple of things. I want this to be as even as possible as far as thick to thinness. I don't want it to be too thin. Obviously, this is too thick. I want somewhere like the size of my thumb or the width of my thumb's pretty good. My pinky or a pencil, like this needle tool, that's just way too small. You kind of have to find this balance. If your coils are too narrow, it's going to be really hard to build with because they're going to be really weak. If it's too thick, it's going to be really hard because your piece is going to get really heavy really fast, and you're also going to have to deal with cracking and things like that. So you have to find that balance of what's too thin and too thick. So to start rolling it, I'm always going to make sure that my hands are together. If they separate, I can get flat spots or unevenness. And so I'm very gently just going to roll back and forth. And this is kind of like when I was using that rolling pin. You know, I'm not using a whole lot of pressure. You can see I'm starting to get longer. I'm getting smoother. And you can probably see it get a little bit more narrow. And so the length of this coil really doesn't matter. The longer it is, maybe the harder it is to work with. The shorter it is, maybe the more you have to make. But that's okay either way. Whatever, you know, everyone does it their own way. So I'm going to just start building this onto the surface. And as I do that, I'm going to pinch. If you can see, I've got a thumb that's going to be on the outside and my index and middle finger in the middle. And I'm just going to squeeze and push down pretty firm to make sure that this doesn't want to come off later. And similar to the pinch pots earlier, you don't need to add any moisture at this point, any water or slip, because both the clays are at the same consistency. And so with this first coil on the inside, I'm going to go ahead and use my fork and really aggressively score this. And this is going to help me blend these together. Because again, this is going to become a really weak point if it's not compressed well. And now I'm just going to use a rib, or I could use my fingers, but I find a rib more comfortable to smooth this out. Sometimes it needs just a little bit of moisture for that rib to spread, but I don't need to drench anything. There we go. And the same thing for the outside. There's not as much, since I've compressed down that edge so much, there's not as much really I need to score, but I can just take my rib or finger and compress that around. There we go. So now I'm going to grab the extra bit of my coil and just start putting this on. And so as I put this on, again, I'm going to have my thumb on the inside and my index finger and ring finger on the outside. So essentially my fingers on the outside are just adding support because my thumb is doing all the work here. My thumb is coming down and pushing that clay onto the clay below it. And so again, these fingers are making sure that I don't just spread this out too far. And as I do this, I'm going to always keep that extra coil suspended in the air. And that's going to allow the clay to just more naturally fall into place. If you try and put the coil on first, it's not going to fit right. And you're going to have an uneven wall. And so as I get to that joint where that beginning of the coil is, I'm just going to start wrapping on top. And now I'm going to make an extra coil to keep building. So same idea, I'm just starting where I left off. And again, that Lazy Susan lets me just spin this naturally and easily so I don't have to move the piece or move the board. I'm going to grab just another small coil. I like to go 3 coils high before I start to compress them. There we go. And to compress them, again, to talk about strength and making sure these really blend well, I'm going to use my fork to just score these together so they blend easier. And then come back with my rib. And keep compressing. So this is that kind of point where you start to see that that perfect 6-inch circle would be pretty much altered right now and look different anyways. So that's why I wasn't too worried about the accuracy. And again, similar to the pinch pots, you know, this surface, I can only get so smooth right now. So basically I'm gonna worry about that later. So I need to do the same to the inside. So these forks, like I mentioned, are really great, but you can also find, sometimes in the bookstore, but mostly on the World Wide Web, these ribs that have a little bit of serrated teeth to them are really great for quickly scoring a lot of clay. And I'm using this green plastic rib, but you could use the metal rib, would be really effective. Or wooden ribs, sometimes they're a bit cumbersome. But everyone's got a feel that they like. Okay. So I can see in my image that, again, some of this ear part I'm going to add later. But I need to start moving up into this jawline area. And so it looks like this jawline is more built kind of through slit, that decoration, rather than being really structurally coming out a whole lot. But I need to think about how wide this face is and what height that midpoint is. So without the ears, the width of the face is just a little bit over 3.5. So it's going to go to about 7 inches, so a little wider. Well, let's see, that nose is about 6 inches up. Let's see where we are. So I'm at 4 inches, so I'm not quite at that nose level, so I can make some more additions. Knowing that I need to get a little bit wider, but not a whole lot. And again, sometimes it's easier to build straight up, and then I can sort of widen it as I go. And I would recommend making coils as you need them, rather than making a bunch, just because they tend to dry out a lot. And once they dry out, they don't connect as well. So just under 6 inches. But I'm at 3 layers, so I'm going to go ahead and compress now. And the same for the inside. I'm just going to go a little bit higher to get to that 6-inch point. Right now you can probably see that it looks a little bit misshapen, asymmetrical, a little rough in the verticality, straightness of it. You know, all of that is, we found with pinch pots is going to be a lot easier to clean up as this dries up. So I'm not going to fret that yet. So there's 2 coils, and yep, that's at 6 inches. So let me just round this out. You can press that really well. So at this point, I'm going to have to stop and let this set up a little bit before I start building out for this ear decoration. And I'm about where that nose starts, so I can start making some adjustments for the mouth and things like that. But I'm going to let this stiffen up a bit because right now it's really floppy. So I'm just going to give it some final compressions on the inside, especially around this edge of the rim. What's the rim right now? Just to make sure that it's nice and even and doesn't want to crack. So right now this is going to stop. I'm going to leave this uncovered for probably just about an hour, just to get a little bit of more stiffness to it.